Esteemed people. Okay, excellent. So welcome everyone to our Friday Transportation Seminar. My name is Jennifer Dill. I'm a faculty member and director of the Center for Transportation Studies. And normally I stand up here and give the introduction of the speaker, but today I'm also the speaker. So I'm going to do both. Introduce myself, and I will, for those of you who have not attended a seminar here before, we do webcast the seminars. And because of that, when we get to the question and answer period, we ask that you use the microphones that are on most of the desks around the room and hold the touch button and keep the red light lit while you're asking the question so the people watching on the web can hear. If for some reason either you don't have a microphone or it doesn't work, one of my trusty colleagues here will come around with a portable mic to make sure that everyone hears the question. So, and I want to acknowledge my colleagues who helped co-organize the seminar. Chris Munster and John Glebe are here today. So welcome, everyone. So let's go ahead and get started. For a couple of reasons, actually, I want to try to start on time. It is Bike to Work, National Bike to Work Week. And also PSU is having a Bike to PSU challenge this month, which is one of the reasons I scheduled the talk for today. So I encourage any of you who do Bike to PSU to sign up and record your trips so we can show how much cycling is going on to campus. The other thing that I noticed is on the little postcard that had the talk listed, it said noon to 1, and we actually scheduled this to 1:30. So if some of you do need to leave at 1, I won't be offended or hurt and understand why you need to get back to work or whatever. So without further ado, let's get started. So first I want to do some, whoops, sorry I had muted. There we go. Wanted some acknowledgements to start out. First of all, the funding for this research came from the Active Living Research Program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and also from the Oregon Transportation Research and Education Consortium. So I thank them for their support. And I've had many students working on this project as research assistants and could not have done it without them. And I'm pretty sure they're all listed here, and several of them are here in the room. And without their help, this would not have happened. And then all of the participants who were participants in the research. Okay, so to give a little background on what the study was all about, it started out with one basic research question of how does the built environment influence bicycling behavior? And that's what the Robert Wood Johnson Active Living Program is all about, is how can we change the physical environment where people live to hopefully get people more active and healthier. And so that was the overarching question that led to this research. And then a secondary question that's relevant to what I'm presenting today is what routes do bicyclists take? Because what infrastructure do they use? Because that also helps us answer that question of the built environment and how it influences. So if people, for example, go out of their way to use bike lanes or bike paths, that's good to know because that shows some value for those facilities. So those are two research questions. There's a lot more, but those are some overarching ones that are relevant for today. The larger study was conducted in two phases. First of all, we did a random phone survey of Portland, Oregon region adults about their bicycling behavior, and I've presented that before here, and there's an article that has some of the results that I'm happy to share with you, but I'm not going to talk about that much today. So that was to get an overall picture of bicycling in the region. Then the second phase, which is what I'm talking about today, involved using GPS, global positioning systems, to actually find out exactly where people do bicycle and how much they bicycle and how fast and if it's uphill or downhill, what routes they take, how they make those decisions, etc. The idea being is that on a phone survey there's only so much data you can get. You definitely can't get a lot of detailed route information. And there's also a question of how accurate that data is when people just try to remember where they went or how often they biked and things like that. And there's a thought that GPS might be a more accurate way of getting that information. So the GPS data collection itself used this unit, a Garmin IQ, which was a PDA with a GPS built into it. And one reason we went with this option is that it allowed the user to input some data about their trip. For example, and you probably can't see it that well, but the user would put in, I'm going to work, or I'm going shopping, or we would get the trip purpose. And then also they would give us some information about the weather. And it was their interpretation of the weather. Was it hot, mild, sunny, windy, rainy, things like that, that might influence their route choice decisions in particular. So during 2007, we had 164 people use these units. They kept the unit for hopefully at least 7 days, and they were supposed to take it on all of the bike trips that they took, with a few exceptions. We did not want people who were, doing a cyclocross race or something like that, that type of behavior, or if they were a bike messenger, we didn't necessarily want to include all of their bike messengering work trips, things like that. We asked them we said they didn't need to take it. The other thing I want to emphasize is this is not a random representative sample. How we found these people, we started out with the people who had done the phone survey and asked them if they wanted to participate, and some of them did. And then it was basically what happened is a different Oregonian reporter did a very short article that got into Oregonian. It was like on the last page of the section on Sunday or something. It was about this tall. And that got out to lots and lots of sources, lots and lots of web pages and lists and things like that. And a lot of people just contacted us and say, yes, I want to participate. We also did some, because we were getting, obviously that's going to get a lot of people who are very avid regular cyclists who are on those email lists and web pages, etc. We wanted to try to broaden the range of types of cyclists we were getting in this study to include people who didn't necessarily cycle every day, because we want to get people who are not everyday cyclists, because we want the full range of behavior. And so we also did some targeted, we did flyers at bike shops, we did some other targeted outreach to try to get some other participants, and then there was a second article in Oregonian that specifically talked about that generated some more response. So we actually had probably over 500 people or so contact us saying, yeah, I'd like to participate. And all of those people, we had them complete an online version of the phone survey that gave us some background information about their cycling behavior and their demographics and all sorts of other stuff. And with that information, we selected participants to try to get a range. For example, we tried to get more women than really women represent in terms of the cycling population. So we were trying to get a geographic spread and things like that. So I just want to emphasize this isn't a random sample of cyclists. But I think it does capture fairly well regular, everyday cyclists. But I'm going to explore that a bit further. So as I've already explained, the participant enters some data, the trip purpose and weather, and then they were also supposed to check if they were taking their bike on transit, so we could differentiate when the bike was on transit versus when they're actually riding it. Then and when I say we in this case, I really do mean the graduate students who were working on the project, who delivered the unit to them and picked it up. They download the data and take all of those points. Basically, the GPS unit every 3 seconds recorded where that person was. So take all of that data, process it with some nifty work that Matt Waddell did, and create a map like this. And that shows where the trip started, where it ended, gives some information about the time of day. And then we would put that online, and the participant would go online and look at each map and answer a series of questions. First of all, trying to figure out if it was accurate. Did the GPS record what actually happened? And then ask some questions about their route choice decision. So what was important to you when you chose this particular route? And then asked about missing data. Were there any trips that were missed? We also asked some general questions about, did having the unit with you affect your behavior in any way, things like that. So there's a follow-up survey. Then, with the results of their follow-up survey, We tried to fix, if they told us, oh no, that's not where I went, I really went on this street. We actually had to go in and manually fix a lot of the trips. So it was a very time-consuming, data-intensive process. When you think about, and I'm going to, the number of participants, the number of trips, data every 3 seconds, I was thinking I should come up with a count, like an inventory, to tell you some of these numbers, but I didn't get around to it. But it's a huge amount of data, and that's why it's taken a while for us to come up with these results. So this is a map that shows sort of where our participants live within the region. And you can see there's a lot of concentration on the east side of Portland, sort of between the river and I-205. That's actually where there's a higher concentration of people who bicycle. We did not get a whole lot of people living east of I-205, which was unfortunate. But we also have people living on the west side, Beaverton, Lake Oswego, out in that direction as well. And then this is just an overview. The pink lines is basically everywhere everyone rode. But the thickness of the line does not, they're all the same, okay? If we did a thickness of the line for how many times someone rode on that street, I'm sure the downtown would just be a huge blob. So this gives you an overview. People bicycled all over the region, obviously concentrated in the city of Portland and the east side and downtown, but still we got people riding all over. This is a bit of a close-up of the city of Portland. But I think what it does is it gives you an idea that we have pretty good data about a lot of different bicycle facilities and types of roads that people were riding on. And so there's a lot of information that we can glean from the data. So today what I'm going to talk about is the data from 149 participants out of our 164. We have 15 participants that we've had various technical issues with processing their data that we are working on, and so we hope to be able to add them before we sort of do the final results, but I don't think they're going to change the overall findings significantly. To give you an idea about those 149 participants, 45% are women, and like I said, we specifically tried to recruit women into the study, and so to make sure that we had enough so we could look at women's travel versus men's travel separately. 83% of these participants have a bachelor's degree, so fairly educated population. 73% have an household income of $50,000 or more, and 10% had an income under $25,000. 71% of them were employed full-time. They were mainly drivers, and that was part of the screening. We were particularly interested in people who were making a choice between driving or riding a bike or transit and other modes, because the whole idea of the Robert Wood Johnson Active Living Program is how do you get people to become more active, and in particular, how do you get people out of their cars and biking or driving. So we tried to recruit in particular and select participants who did have a car in the household. And so only 6% of these participants had no motor vehicle in the household, and all but 2 of them had a driver's license. 28% of them had children under 18 in the household, which is just slightly lower than the regional average. So we did get a number of people with families with kids. These 149 participants, we recorded and were able to process 1,689 bike trips. Of those, 1,530 were 100% on bike, no transit component at all. And a lot of times I'm only looking at those 1,530. It's a lot of bike trips, and when we finish up those last 15, those numbers are going to go up a little bit. To give you an idea of sort of the richness of this data set, I looked, a source of data that a lot of transportation planners use and researchers like myself use is the National Household Travel Survey, which is a national survey of people's travel that was last done in 2001 of several thousand households in the U.S. and every person in the household, and we often use that data to sort of figure out how people travel, etc. That survey only had 767 bike trips total for the entire U.S. And again, that's just, there's no detailed information on those trips. The 1994 Portland travel survey that was done, the activity survey, had just over 800 bike trips in their 2-day survey. So it's a huge amount of data. And I think it's going to keep myself and my colleagues who are working with this, it's going to keep us very busy for quite some time, digging all of the data out of it. So what does that data look like? So first I'm going to present just some basic information, and then I'll get into sort of the use of different facilities a bit more. These participants averaged 1.5 bike trips per day. And one thing I should clarify is, how do we define a trip? A trip is any time you go from one destination to another. So if you leave your home and start riding to work, but you stop for coffee along the way, that's one trip. And going from the coffee or whatever to your work, that's another trip. Work back home is another trip. So each one-way trip to a different destination. If you go out for a ride just for exercise, make a big loop and come back home, that's one trip if you did that without stopping. So on average, 1.5 trips per day. There were several people, this is the total, what the graph is showing is the total number of trips that the participants made while they had the GPS unit. And you could see that about half of the people made 10, right around 10 trips, and then there were some people up here, you know, who were making 20 or 30 or more trips, lots of trips. But most people were in that middle range. And we had a full range, you know, people who mainly only made 1 or 2 trips over that entire 7-day period. So where were they riding? And this is based on the information that they plugged in, or if they told us afterwards that was wrong, it got corrected. Going back home is a separate trip, so that's why 32% of the trips was going back home from somewhere else. 26% of the trips was going to work, so a lot of commuting going on. And then you can see social, recreational, going sort of around the circle. Personal business, which would be, you know, going to the bank, that kind of thing. Shopping. Exercise in our sample was only 6% of all of the trips. And this is, this is reflective of the people that we sampled and the type of biking that they do. Nationally, most biking people do for exercise, at least adults. They're doing it for exercise and recreation, going out on a trail, etc. Our riders are riding primarily for what we call utilitarian reasons, to get to the places they need to go to conduct their daily life. And then you can see dining, work-related, other, and school. The other thing to note here, with 32% of the trips being going back home and the other 68% being somewhere else, this indicates that people are trip chaining on their bike. In other words, they're going to work and then they're stopping somewhere else and then they're going home. And it's not just going to work and back. So they're using their bikes like drivers use their cars and making trips. And that's possible when you have a community where land uses allow that to happen, like we do in lots of parts of Portland. So what about distances? About half of the trips were 3 miles or less. So the median trip length, if you're into sort of the statistical terms, was 3 miles. And this is the distribution of all of the trips. And so, like I said, half of the trips were 3 miles or less, and then they start, you know, there are fewer trips sort of in the range of, let's say, 5 miles to 10 miles, and then 10% of the trips were over 10 miles. And those were, a lot of those were more recreational trips, people going out on a long bike ride, usually on the outer parts of the region. The trip distances did vary by purpose. In the middle there you see all trips, median is 3 miles. The work trips, the median distance was 4.1 miles, so people are traveling farther to go to work. The recreation trips, exercise trips I should say, the median was just under 8 miles. And then here you have social, recreation, work-related, personal business, shopping, dining was only, the median distance was 1 mile. So people are able to, you know, bike to these destinations. What that implies is that they're able to bike to these destinations relatively close to home or to other destinations where they're biking. So how fast were they going? On average, they were going 10 miles per hour, and that's the overall speed for the entire trip. And that includes zero velocity, so when people are stopped. So that's an overall average. We have detailed information for each link that in the network that they rode on, how fast were they going, whether they were going uphill or downhill. So we will be able to say that on these types of facilities, people on average biked this fast or this slow or whatever. And that's going to be useful when we start talking about using this data for modeling and travel demand modeling and route choice. So this shows you the distribution. You know, some people were getting pretty fast, over 18 miles an hour, but for the most part, right around 10 miles per hour. And there were some demographic differences. Men generally cycled faster than women, was one particular one. And there were also some differences by facility type. And as you might expect, there was a moderate negative correlation, meaning speeds were slower when more of the trip happened on a minor street, like a neighborhood street, not necessarily bike boulevard, but just a neighborhood street. So that makes sense. Neighborhood streets you're going to travel slower on because there might be more stop signs or intersections and that type of thing. And people tended to be able to travel faster if a lot of their trip was on an arterial with a bike lane, or if a lot of their trip was on a path, a separated path. So some things that as a cyclist you probably instinctively know, but it's good to document some of this. We asked people on each of their trips afterwards, we said, okay, did you have a car available to make this trip? And if so, why did you decide to bike instead of drive? The vast majority answered our general category of, for health, exercise, pleasure. Almost virtually everyone said that was one of the reasons that they biked instead of driving. 89% said I wanted to reduce my impact on the environment. 73% said I wanted to save money. 46% said riding my bike was faster. I think that's a really large percent, and I think that is, people have the maybe misconception that the bike is generally slower, but in some cases it isn't. There's a question. Is it a clarification question?
No, I just wondering that the 46% of the faster this group, what's the distance for them?
Oh, I have not looked at that yet, and that's actually the question was what was the distance of those trips? I have not looked yet, and that's sort of one of the maybe next steps in the analysis. And just to maybe jump ahead a little bit, so since the question came up, one of the things that we are specifically going to do with this data is for all of the trips, we know where they started and we know where they ended. And we are going to try to predict how long it would take to drive between those 2 points and compare it to how long it took the person to bike. So we can see in which locations and at which times of day is the bike time competitive with a car. So that's part of the next step in the analysis. 29%, the weather, it was good weather, and only 8% said someone else in the household needed the car, that was available. So those are some of the motivations amongst these people for biking. So where are they biking? And this is really the exciting, some of the exciting stuff. So if you take all of the miles of travel that we were able to record with the GPS units for these 149 people, and we link that up with the network, 51% of all of their miles happen on some sort of a road without a bike facility. So no bike lane, no bike boulevard, no path. 49% of it happened on what I'm calling here bike infrastructure. So it happened on an arterial with a bike lane, either a primary or secondary, a minor street with a bike lane. These are the classifications that Metro uses for the network. A bike path or a bike boulevard. And so, and this is all the travel that we recorded. So 15%, for example, of the mileage of the 6,883 miles of travel happened on bike paths, 9% happened on bike boulevards, and then you can see the distribution here that was happening on bike lanes. that sounds like a lot. And I saw that, I thought, wow. I don't know what my expectation was. I didn't necessarily have an expectation, but that surprised me, what such a high share was happening on the bike facilities. I thought, and especially 15% happening on bike paths. I thought, well, what if I take out the exercise travel? How is that going to affect things? And it didn't affect things a whole lot. So if we take out the non-exercise travel, so just the utilitarian, getting to work, to school, shopping, etc., actually a higher percentage of that is happening on bike facilities. 52% is happening on bike infrastructure. So there wasn't a big difference. And then you think, okay, well, how does that compare to the infrastructure? And so if you take the entire network, road network within the urban growth boundary that is available to bicyclists, so you take out the freeways, other places bikes legally aren't allowed, this is the network. So only 8%, I'm trying to highlight, only 8% of the network that is available to bicyclists region-wide is what I've termed bike infrastructure. But half of the travel is happening on that infrastructure, at least the travel amongst our participants. And so, the first conclusion is that people are really using the infrastructure that's being provided. Now, if you remember, we didn't have a whole lot of participants sort of east of I-205 and in Gresham and those areas. So I did decide to look specifically at City of Portland residents more narrowly. So any of our participants who lived in the City of Portland, and it was a significant share of them, this is what their travel looks like. So again, half of their travel was happening on bike infrastructure, and 15% by our sort of measures, 15% of the infrastructure that is available to bicyclists is bike infrastructure. And so you can see here, for example, bike boulevards, 10% of these cyclist travel was happening on bike boulevards. Bike boulevards represent about 1% of what's out there available to bicyclists. So they definitely, and the same with the bike lanes as well, particularly if you add up, that's 23% of the travel or so is happening on facilities with bike lanes, and that's only 9% of the infrastructure, which indicates that cyclists are definitely going out of their way to use this infrastructure, because it's not that they all are living exactly on these facilities. And that's part of the next step of the analysis as well. So one of the objectives of the research, if it isn't obvious already, is how do we get more people bicycling? How do we change the physical environment so that people are attracted to cycling as a mode of transportation? And so one thing I wanted to do is look at certain subgroups of our sample to see where are they cycling and how does it differ. So in particular, so far what I've looked at is men versus women, and what I've categorized as frequent versus infrequent cyclists. And this was based on their sort of historical bicycling behavior, and I separated what I'm calling infrequent as someone who during the summer bikes 10 or fewer days per month. Okay. Now for the general population, that's a really frequent cyclist, but for this population of 149 cyclists, that was infrequent. So I've characterized, I'm looking at those pairs of groups. Why am I looking at these groups? First of all, we know both with Portland data and data nationally that women are less likely to cycle for transportation. We found this in the phone survey. You see this in the counts. There's trends that it's improving, but in general, most regular utilitarian cyclists are men. And so if we really want to increase rates of cycling as a transportation mode, we really do need to attract more women to cycling. So I wanted to look at this group in particular. And traffic is a barrier to women cycling more so than men. So one of the questions on our survey that everyone took beforehand was, what barriers are keeping you from cycling more? What physical environmental barriers? And one of them that we had listed was too much traffic. 52% of women said that this was a barrier to them cycling more, and only 34% of men said that it was a barrier. So it's a bigger issue in general for women than it is for men. We had another question on there about whether people agreed or disagreed with the statement, car is safer than bike. And in this case, men and women didn't differ too much. If we look at the infrequent versus frequent cyclists, again, traffic is a barrier, more of a barrier for infrequent cyclists, and those infrequent cyclists are much more likely to think that the car is safer than the bike. Okay, so there's bigger safety concerns amongst the people who cycle infrequently versus frequently. You would expect that. That's part of the reason why they're not cycling as much. So when we look at these groups, where are they bicycling? What infrastructure are they using? In terms of men versus women, I've now sort of put the different types of infrastructure in two different categories. And first I'm looking at what I'm calling the higher motor vehicle traffic facilities. So the facilities where you're more likely to have more cars and trucks motorized driving on the road. And the rows that are in the orange, red, rust, whatever color, are where there's a statistically significant difference between men and women. And so here you see that in terms of all of their bike travel that we recorded, men were spending a higher percentage of their travel on the arterials that have bike lanes or that don't have bike lanes. And those are going to be facilities that have more traffic. Whereas the women, only, for example, 6% of the women's travel was on a primary arterial with a bike lane, and 10% of men's travel was on those facilities. If we look at the lower motor vehicle traffic facilities, so in this case, minor streets without bike lanes, so those are your neighborhood streets that a lot of us probably live on. Minor streets with bike lanes, bike paths, and the bike boulevards. This is where you see that women are more likely to be cycling on some of these types of infrastructure. So 11% of women's mileage was on the bike boulevards compared to 8% of men's. 36% of their mileage was on the minor streets without bike lanes compared to 30% of men. So it does seem that women and men, I mean, they're statistically significant differences. You can judge for yourself whether the absolute differences are big differences in your mind, but there's definitely a pattern here of women using different facilities to a different extent than men. And to sort of, if we combine some of those categories, if you look at any road with a bike lane, 27% of men's travel was on any type of road with a bike lane. Only 23% of women's travel was. 69% of women's travel was on those facilities with the least motor vehicle traffic, the paths, the boulevards, or minor streets, compared to 59% of men's travel. For looking at the frequent versus infrequent, we see some similar patterns. The frequent cyclists are more likely, more of their miles are on the higher traffic facilities, higher motor vehicle traffic facilities. And infrequent cyclists, more of their miles in particular are on bike paths. And I think this is the sort of the common perception that people who don't cycle very often are more likely to be using paths, and this data is showing that. The one thing that I'm going to be exploring a lot more down here is the bike boulevard difference. The frequent cyclists were spending more of their mileage on bike boulevards. And so the next steps of the analysis is try to figure out how much of this is a location, and my guess is what we're going to find is that people who are living in neighborhoods with bike boulevards are cycling a lot more. And the phone survey the findings from that are consistent with that hypothesis. The highest rates of cycling that we saw was in the inner southeast Portland neighborhoods where a lot of the bike boulevards are. They were in neighborhoods with well-connected streets close to downtown, which is also where the bike boulevards are. Part of the message I'm starting to see in this data is really supporting the concept of bike boulevards. I mean, we have a lot more analysis to do. This is sort of the first cut, but that's one trend or one theme that keeps coming out from the data. So for each of the trips that people made, we asked them, how important were these factors in choosing your route? And we had a list of things that they were supposed to score on a 1 to 5 scale, not very important to very important. The top 2 most important things were avoiding streets with lots of vehicle traffic and minimizing total distance. Riding, and then followed by riding a bike lane, reducing wait time due to stoplights and signs, riding on signed bike routes, riding on paths, and avoiding hills. So just a few more things, and again, I'm only touching the surface of what's in this data, but I think there's some interesting things already. A few more sort of differences between our groups. The infrequent cyclists, their trips were generally shorter, about a mile shorter than the frequent cyclists, so they aren't cycling as far to get places. And they were less likely to be cycling for commuting and more for exercising. Though still a majority of their trips were not for exercise. It was for utilitarian purposes. In terms of women versus men, women and men were making about the same number of trips over the time that we recorded them, but women's trips tended to be shorter. And their trip purposes were actually very similar to men in terms of the share of trips commuting or shopping and exercise, etc. Not any remarkable differences in trip purposes. And then one thing I haven't talked about much, but this is another thing that maybe surprised me a little bit, because again, I had no expectations, because there's no other data out there that really provides a lot of information about bicycling. So I didn't have other research to sort of give me very specific hypotheses about what the behavior would be. We asked people, was another adult with you on this trip? Was a kid with you on the trip? Was the kid on a bike or on a trailer? Did you have a trailer that had something else in it besides a kid? Those types of questions that we thought might influence their route choice. 32% of the trips, they said there was another adult cycling with me, which I thought was fairly high. And for women, 55% of their trips, they said there was another adult cycling with me. I found that fairly remarkable, that there's a lot of, I don't know what you would call it, bike pooling or what. But I think it does point to, if we're talking about facilities, we need to think about facilities that accommodate people cycling together. And I know that's something that Roger Geller has talked about quite a bit, because I think when any of us go to other cities, particularly outside the U.S. where there's a lot of cycling going on, you see cycling as a more of a social. People are cycling places together, and they'd rather be beside each other than behind each other. So that's one reason I throw this out here. And then I just want to talk next steps. There's a lot more to do. I've only sort of touched the surface. Literally, I will tell you, we got the 149 people's data, was finally ready to look at like 10 days ago. And so I spent like a very intense weekend coming up with all of these numbers, and it's just the tip of the iceberg of what we're going to do with this data. So to give you an idea of, we have those 15 more people to get into, and my grad students are already making great progress on that. There's a lot more analysis, and some of which I've already mentioned. There's just a lot more that we're going to do with this. And in particular, I've given you sort of the broad overall numbers. We're going to look around where each cyclist lives, what infrastructure is around them, and how does that relate to where they rode, for example. And as I've already mentioned, we're going to compare each route that was taken to the shortest route that would be available by bike and by car, and figure out exactly how far are cyclists going out of their way to use different bicycle facilities or not use them, and how does that vary by the type of cyclists? I'm sure that there are some cyclists who don't go out of their way, and there's others who do go out of their way, and I'm thinking that there's some reasons for that we'll be able to detect. The people who are more concerned about traffic versus less concerned about traffic, etc. And then again, as I've mentioned, where and when is the bike competitive with the car? And then we are working with Metro to say, okay, we've got all this great data. How can we use it so that Metro can improve their modeling efforts to predict and plan for bicycle travel in the future? Because it's a great data set, and we definitely don't want to use it just, yeah, I'll publish journal articles and present things like this, but it's also great to get that data used and influencing public policy and infrastructure and planning. And so that's one way this is going to be used. And definitely stay tuned for more results. I'm going on sabbatical next year, and I think analyzing this data is going to take up a huge amount of my time that I'm looking forward to. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. And I'm going to remind people to use the microphone on your desk. And if you don't have one, or if it's not working, looks like John has the portable mic to use. So right here.
Can you provide a little bit more detailed description about what the classification for social and recreational type trips or purpose trips? Because, like you're saying, there's a distinction between exercise and also a distinction between shopping, or these like the coffee shops or other purposes.
Yeah. The categories that says social recreation would be, going to a movie theater, going to a gym, where you're actually going to a destination to be social or to recreate. Exercise trips was when you're just riding your bike is the purpose of the trip. You're riding your bike to get exercise and coming back, and not going somewhere in particular. I think there may have been some cases where, someone, and maybe the students who worked on the project with me can remind me, if you were going out to a bar to socialize with friends, whether they would put that under dining or social recreation, there's going to be some overlap there. And I think in the end what we'll do is collapse a lot of those categories together. But the exercise was just, that is the trip. Yeah. Oh, there's got to be more. Okay. Sorry, behind you, and then, yeah. Is that one working?
The light's not on.
Okay, so yeah, get the portable.
When comparing the travel time for cars and bikes, are you going to be able to include, say, the time it takes to shower after a bike trip, or the time it takes to park a car, or are you just going to compare the actual A to B travel time?
The showering thing, no. Because I don't know about you, but okay, I'll admit, I'm probably an infrequent cyclist. But I don't know, maybe if I should. I mean, I'm not showering when I deliberately ride slow. I dress appropriately. So when I get here, I don't have to do that. If I had to do that, I wouldn't be cycling. And so I don't think that if we're going to get more people cycling, you got to make it such that they don't have to do all of that, because otherwise they're not. At least that's my opinion. But in terms of parking time, we're going to have to think about that. I'm looking at John Glebe, who's sort of my co-researcher on that part of the project. And I think we probably could include some assumptions for how long it might take to find a parking space at the end on the driving trip. That's a great idea. The showering, you have a follow-up?
If that would be okay.
If it's follow-up, yeah.
It is a follow-up.
Okay.
Well, I just wonder, at least in terms of people making the determination whether to bike or to drive, they have to take into account on putting on the bike clothes and putting on a helmet or parking the bike. So if you're actually just measuring the travel distance, it didn't seem like that would be a good, it would be a component of, but without making those assumptions, it seems like it would be difficult to make a determination whether people are taking travel time into consideration.
I mean, it's not perfect, but I don't think we have any good data on how long it takes people to get ready to make a bike trip or to get ready to make a car trip. So I don't know if I feel confident that I could include that with any accuracy. And again, I think maybe that's part of the next study, is to ask cyclists about that to get some data. And I think there's going to be a wide range. And those of you who are regular cyclists are probably thinking to yourself, there's probably a huge range of, how much time you take to get ready to make that trip. So I'm not sure. I think it's a very good point, but I'm not sure if I would ever I certainly don't have the data now to make any decent assumptions about that.
Thanks.
Right here. Rob.
A couple questions about the system. One is, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. Remember to use the microphone. Thank you, Mark.
Couple questions about the system. One is, how did you define bike boulevards, or what?
I use the cities. There are 30 miles of bike boulevards that the city.
Okay, so that's City of Portland, but
City of Portland.
Did you classify any bike boulevards outside of the city?
We did not. Did we miss something?
I don't know.
If anyone out there is from Gresham and Beaverton and other places, I don't know of any like real, when I say real, you know, the bike boulevards, you know, the Harrison, Lincoln, the ones that the City of Portland does. I'm not aware of anything on that level outside of the City of Portland, but if I'm missing something, please let me know.
Yeah, that might be an interesting topic for more discussion, because I think we all may have a little bit different definition of what creates a bike boulevard.
Yeah, I mean, these are the facilities that have the traffic calming features and the signage and the lights, the full package. And it is not just this sort of, what are the colors on the City of Portland? It's not just the regular green lines. It's the green with the outer green, exactly. It's for those of you who know the maps. Yeah.
Well, the second question, related question I had was, I thought that the mileage or the percent of the network that was bike paths was surprisingly high to me. So
it was to me too, and so I'll look at it again.
From?
Yeah, it's basically we took the R-list network and took out any facilities that bikes were not allowed on and used the GIS to calculate all the distances. It seemed a little long to me as well, and we'll double check it, but it does include not just the regional paths. It will include, it's not a whole lot of mileage, but it would include short off-street paths through parks and that type of thing. I don't know how much that's going to add up to. I mean, I'll double check those figures, but yeah. Let's see. Right behind, yeah. No, that you in the white shirt, yeah.
In terms of determining the facility, what type of facility, if a trip happened on several facilities, so I go from downtown,
Yeah.
I take Waterfront Park across the Steel Bridge, and then I hop, let's say, on Williams or whatever. How did you figure that? Was it
We
just
know
the majority, or was it?
No. It's exact. I mean, we know. That's why this is a huge amount. We know. So every 3 seconds, we know exactly where they are. So we take all those points, and then we link them to the network. So we know, okay, they went on this road between this point and this point, and I know exactly what road that is, and I know whether or not it has a bike lane or what it is. And so when I say the mileage, it's, you know, yeah, I mean, there's error in data collection, that kind of stuff. But no, we make it's where it's the actual route that they used and the miles for what I've presented here. Kim?
Have you looked at
Microphone. She's my student. I can be a little.
Have you looked at trip purpose and what percentage of those trips are accompanied by adults yet?
Oh, I did when I looked at the first like 90 people. And yeah, if I remember, just the only thing I do remember from that was social recreation trips. It was more likely to be with someone else.
And were people more likely to travel on a specific type of facility when they were in a group?
I had checked that with the first set of data, and the neighborhood streets and bike boulevards maybe, but I want to double check that. And that, when I looked at that, it was for like the first 90 people before. Okay. So I'm going to go here, and then Chris, and then Roger. So we need a microphone up here.
Got this one right here.
Oh, great.
So I'm going to send you a list of questions, but
Yeah, and actually, for those of you who have ideas for questions to answer, yeah, email them to me because that'll help me with ideas. So go ahead.
Okay, so I'm curious about bike boulevards. One thing that you might not be able to answer now is I'm wondering if the infrequent riders might not be using bike boulevards as much as other minor streets, which is still a major component of their trip simply because they don't know they're there or how to use them.
Yeah.
And the second kind of piece for me is I'm wondering the travel speed difference between a bike boulevard streets and minor streets, whether or not you've been able to pull that out yet.
I haven't pulled it out yet, but it would be very easy to do the way we have the data. And whether or not the infrequent cyclists know at the bike boulevard, we'll be able to, when we look at the route that they took, we're going to be able to tell. One thing that we could do is say, okay, was there a bike boulevard within a certain distance of where they were traveling? And so we could look at that specifically. Yeah. Yeah, there's so much. Okay, so did you still have a question?
Sure. Thanks. So my question, and I guess this is something that I could have emailed easily, but I'm wondering if you have any plans to compare not only car travel times in comparison to bike travel times, but also transit, because I was one of the study participants, which is mainly why I'm here today. And from my house, it's actually faster to get downtown by bike than it is by transit. Yeah, that's the same for me. That isn't on our list of things yet. It would certainly be a great thing to look at, and particularly if we got some more funding from OTRAC or somewhere else to hire some more grad students to look at that, or if I get some more PhD students. But that's, I think, because I think it is pretty time competitive with transit a lot of the time, so it'd be a good thing. And I'll talk with John about how feasible that would be. Chris?
We've got a data set over in the ITS lab. We've got a year's worth of the TriMet data, all of the bus GPS data, so you could probably
so it might be
use
easy.
that relatively easy. And Matt Burko's back there is digesting quite a bit of that data. So.
Okay, great.
There's as you imagine, quite a few web questions. So one question right off the bat was, what are the age range of the participants?
Oh, I should have brought that, my printouts of that. I think our youngest was around 21 or 22, and our oldest was 60s or so. We got a fairly good split. We didn't get a whole lot of people over 65, but we got a few, and I have started to look at sort of 3 age groups, or the younger adults, middle adults, and then sort of 50 and above. I didn't have enough to specifically look at 65 and above. And so far, I'm not seeing very consistent patterns in terms of age. So, and that was one thing we also, when we were recruiting, if I got older adults in particular, I definitely got them into the study because we wanted an age range.
And there was quite a few questions about linked transit trips. Did you exclude those here, or are they in your data set?
There were usually footnotes if I excluded them. One of the reasons on this first cut analysis I excluded them is that I have some questions about the quality of that data, and so I want to go in and find out if they truly were transit trips. And so I thought it's safer, especially since I still had 1,500 trips, I felt it a bit safer. In terms of the mileage stuff, though, that included everything, but only the biking miles. Never did I include the part that was on transit in any of this analysis. Yeah. Let's see, Roger?
Thank you. This is great research, Jennifer. Really pretty exciting. And it sounds like you're going to get into choices. And so I'm looking at choices of facility type. So there's a few corridors where people can choose between Bike Boulevard or Minor Street and bike lanes. And it sounds like you're going to go in and sort of dig that stuff out. And it's probably easiest to do when they're more or less parallel. But I wonder if you'll also look at people going from point A to point B and identifying different routes that people could use, whether there might be a bike lane route that is different from a route that emphasizes minor streets and bike boulevards, not necessarily parallel, but you can get there two different ways.
Yeah, that's actually what we are hoping to do. We put in an application for OTREC funding for the next cycle that we're waiting to hear, John Glebe and I, and that would fit into that analysis because you can come up with alternative paths that they can take, and a path, and when I say route, one that would give emphasis to using bike lanes, and you can give it different attributes. So I would hope that we'll at some point do that. It's going to take some time, though. So.
Yeah, and then just to follow up to that, do you have enough data to determine why somebody maybe chose a bike lane over a bike boulevard when they had an option? Or do you see that as a possible future opportunity for research?
We know their answers to those questions, like what was important to you. So to the extent that those questions covered it, we know their demographics. We know some of their attitudes about safety. We know their history of how much they've cycled. So we can try to use all of that data to try to explain why. So I think we might be able to get at that. Yeah. Okay, Mark, and then we're going to go in the back.
Maybe I missed this when you described it, but the average trip length, I assume that was every trip.
Yes.
Have you done anything that looks at where there were linked trips, what the average trip was?
Oh, all linked together?
Yeah.
We have not done that yet. And the 3 miles was the median trip length. The average is actually longer because you have a lot of really long trips that brings the mean. That's why I did the median. We haven't looked at that yet, but certainly could. Sort of what is the full tour that they took. In the back in the green shirt, and he needs a microphone.
I have 2 questions. The first, in your data set, said the group of people in your research have 1.5 average trip make every day. Just for the same group of people, how many trips do they make? I assume this 1.5 is bicycle only
It's
trip.
bike trips.
All trips, how many?
We did not collect
You
data
don't
on the
have
rest
that.
of their
Okay.
travel. Yeah, I mean, ideally we would have known all of their travel.
Yeah, if you
We
know
felt it
that,
was an
that's
awful lot to ask
be
them everything that
very
we-
interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, this
We-
is first. Second question that when you compare the woman and the men, their travel patterns for the bicycling, you have 2 points. The first is that the woman makes shorter trips. That's easy, very easy to understand. The second point is that their purpose, trip purpose is similar. That also easy to understand. But if you put those 2 together, and if we exclude the exercise trips, does that imply that women, they're walking always shorter, closer to their house?
It
Or
might.
their other activity always
Or they're
Oh.
choosing closer destinations. I mean, that could be part of it.
if their purpose is similar,
Yeah.
the trip distance should be almost.
Well, but-
It's kind of interesting.
No, I
that-
think that's a good point and something that I'll dig into. I mean, I think it could be a lot of things. It could be that the women who are more likely to be cyclists are more likely to be living in places where the destinations are close. And the women who are living in places where destinations are further away aren't cycling and didn't get captured here, whereas men who do cycle more in general are living in wider ranges of environments and therefore traveling farther. There is, I mean, in terms of travel in general, women's work trips tend to be shorter for all modes nationally, just in general. I mean, there could be, but it's definitely worth digging into. I'm going to, because there's a lot of hands, and we're going to, so Stephen, did you still have a question?
Yeah. Last year in your initial round of analysis, I think I remember you had some findings on topography and how hills factor into people's decisions. I was wondering if there were any interesting updated findings about hills and topography.
I haven't looked at hills yet. Yeah. I have not. I mean, definitely when the survey, the phone survey, people who lived in hillier areas were less likely to be regular cyclists. The only thing specifically is like when we look at route choice decisions, I separate out the exercise trips because for exercise trips, sometimes people want the hills to get the extra exercise. So that's the only thing so far I've looked at. So, yeah. Becky.
Will you be able to get into sort of the chicken and egg question of living in places that have bike facilities and biking more, as far as are people knowing that they want to bike, and so they're choosing to live in a place where they can bike to things, or are they there and they're like, oh, there's this bike boulevard, so maybe I should get a bike and think about using it?
So on the regional phone survey, we asked people, everyone, whether they biked or not, I think. Well, anyway, we asked them how important, when you were choosing where you're living, how important was bicycling environment to you? And it was important to a very, very small percentage of the people, even when you looked at the regular cyclists. So I think we will, and all of our participants answered that question as well. And so we will be able to look at that and see, you know, how much does your cycling behavior relate to how important it was, and try to get at that. So, 'cause it's a very good point in the blue shirt here.
I just want to follow up on the question about why people are riding versus driving. And one of the, I guess my first question is just a clarification. In terms of the options that people gave, were those prescribed?
They were.
Yeah. Well,
I don't know if it was a great list.
That's okay. I'm also following up on the point that Zach mentioned, and that's parking. Because I'm fascinated by how parking policy affects mode choice, and whether or not, and maybe this isn't something you can pick out of your existing data, but whether or not it's something that would be interesting later on, is that question of parking. And as Portland grows and it becomes, you know, the city becomes more dense and parking becomes an even more acute problem, whether or not people are going to be moving towards transit and hopefully cycling just to avoid the headache of finding parking.
The headache and the cost. I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we will, I mean, this is great because you guys are also giving me lots of ideas of more things to spend my sabbatical on. But I mean, we know where the trip ended. So we would know, in general, what you have to pay for parking in that, you know, if it's downtown or Lloyd District, for example. So we might be able to look at, you know, those trips differently than the others, and look at their, you know, the two questions on that, why did you ride a bike instead of drive? You know, there's the saving money, which can be both gas but also parking, and there's the, you know, it's faster than the car, which is both the driving time plus the parking time is included there. So we can maybe dig at that a little bit.
I'm curious, can you give us some insight to the recommendations that you would like to see as you manage this data? And where do you see Portland lacking, let's say like linkages between like Beaverton and Gresham to Portland, or maybe Vancouver to Portland, or what? Just some insight if you thank you.
Yeah, I specifically took out the conclusions and recommendations slide. I mean, partly because, as I think I've implied, I'm not quite done. But, you know, I'm definitely headed in some certain directions. And actually, just yesterday, I was asked, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation helped the Congressional Bike Caucus that Earl Blumenauer is in charge of. Because it's Bike to Work Week, they wanted to have a briefing in D.C. at the Capitol to talk about the research that's going on for bicycling. So I went to that to present some of these findings, to say, you know, give some ideas about federal policy. And because I had to do that, I've had to sort of go on record for what I think should be done based on what I've researched. And definitely what I said is, you know, that there's a full range of infrastructure that's necessary. It's not just bike lanes. Bike lanes are important, but particularly if you want to get new people to cycle, you got to consider a full range of infrastructure. So in Portland, it's the boulevards and the paths that are added to that, and the neighborhood connected streets, even if they don't have bike facilities on them, a well-connected street pattern. You know, if you look in Europe, there's other types of infrastructure like cycle tracks that also get at that issue of being near motor vehicle traffic. So that was one message that I definitely sent, is the wide range. So here. It doesn't move, sorry.
How do you define car availability? And are you making any kind of corrections to that when it comes to trip chaining? Say a person starts from home, the car's available, he goes from home to point A.
Oh.
Then from point A to point B.
Well, of course they don't have
available.
No, not anymore, is it?
Would have been if you planned in advance.
Yeah.
So Is there any way to?
That's a very good point. First of all, car available, I mean, it was whether whether the participant said I had a car available. But you're right, we should look at that for the chain trips to see how they answered, because we asked it on each specific trip. So on that first trip where you started riding your bike, the car may have been at home, but the second part of the trip, well, it's no longer available because it's back at home. So I'll have to look into that. That's a very good point. Oh, I think he needs the microphone because it doesn't work.
Thank you. Are you able to distinguish with your data whether people are riding on sidewalks? Because I was kind of surprised that the number of people who are riding on primary arterials, and I wonder, especially for East Portland, if some of that travel along those arterials is actually done not in the lane but on the sidewalk.
Very good question, and no, we're not. The GPS is not accurate enough for us to know whether they're in a car lane, a bike lane, sidewalk, where. It just gets us on the street. And we did not ask that as a follow-up question. Yeah, so that's one thing that we're going to miss. Right here.
Are there any other data sets out there, maybe vehicle speeds and volumes, that you might be able to compare this to draw conclusions about route choice and actual motor vehicle behavior rather than just infrastructure on the road itself?
In terms of like driving times between these different locations?
What I'm really curious about is if cyclists are choosing different routes that would both be classified as an arterial or a collector, when the actual motor vehicle behavior is different on those on a route that's okay. So if you have two routes that would be classified the same with the typical classification, but vehicles actually behave different on the two, if you can make a distinction as to whether or not the cyclist is going to choose one of those because of that.
I don't know if we'll be able to do that.
We have a volume map.
We have volumes.
And we have
So if you say if behavior is volume and speed, maybe. But some of that is, I mean, you don't have every single link in the network.
And you could also look at traffic calming. Like I imagine 21st Avenue in Southeast would be a minor arterial that people are on, but it's got speed bumps. So, does that then minor arterial traffic calming then become more attractive than that type of thing?
So I guess we could do some of that. Maybe I need 2 years of sabbatical. Okay, I'm going to go in the back to someone. Steve, you haven't asked.
I guess just sort of a general question. You mentioned you went back to Washington, D.C. to talk about this, and so I'm hoping that other people are doing similar sorts of studies right now. Do you have any others, a sense of what else is going on? Because it seems like an easily replicable study to do.
Yeah. I don't know of anything quite like it. Let's see. There is, like the other people who were presenting with me were not collecting sort of data on people's bicycle behavior. They were looking at bike funding or policy making with respect to biking. There has been some work as part of the last reauthorization of the Surface Transportation Act. There was a program that put in $25 million or a huge amount of money into several specific communities to increase bicycling, if I'm getting this all right. They are collecting some before and after data, so that includes Minneapolis, Marin County, someplace in Missouri. Someone else probably knows. Columbia, Missouri, St. Paul. They're collecting some before and after data, but again, not putting the GPS, not the detailed route stuff. There are more and more sort of regional travel surveys that are perhaps in the future going to be using personal wearable GPS, so everyone carries a GPS with them for their biking, walking, transit, and everything. So in theory, the more of those studies that happen in the future, we'd have more bike stuff. But again, if you just do a random sample of adults, you're not going to get a huge amount of cyclists in those samples. So there isn't a lot, and there's not a lot out yet. I would hope, that maybe we'll be able, once we've done this one, that maybe there'll be some other researchers, or we'll do it elsewhere, do some more. Or also, the other thing that I would love to do is follow people over time. Because the whole idea is, for example, do these infrequent cyclists, do they become more frequent cyclists if you improve the network? Or are they just always going to be infrequent cyclists? I mean, do people, how do they change their behavior? And so you figure that out by following people over time. So if we could go back to these 164 people, if they would let us, most of them I think were very, very cooperative and enjoyed, I think, the process, though there were technical difficulties here and there. If we went back to those people, see how their behavior changes. So let's see. Dan, did you still have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, most of them have been answered. I wanted to say that your survey data on the perception of danger between gender, men and women, was spot on with the survey we did last year.
Oh, good.
The other question I had was, can we tell with data every 3 seconds whether people ran stop signs?
No.
And I say that only jokingly, but I was
Actually,
wondering
we
if
can't.
You can't do that? Okay.
And
so no prosecution.
I mean, technically we can't because we don't know when the light was red or green, right? And the stop sign, no, I don't think.
I guess I was thinking about bike boulevards, if we could see the frequency of if the speed.
I guess technically we could.
You don't have to.
But I'm looking back at Matt, who is the main person who dealt with a lot of this data. I'm just thinking, God, that would be such a headache. I need another full-time computer programmer to maybe.
What if they trip change to the emergency room?
We do, and actually we specifically told our participants, I'm pretty sure we specifically told them that we couldn't detect things like that because we didn't want to change their riding behavior. So if they were making illegal maneuvers, we said we're not going to look at that. Technically, we do know if they went the wrong way on a one-way street, but we're not.
Can you see on a bike boulevard their speed pattern going like this? Do you have enough data?
We could. We'd have to look and see how accurate that speed data is. There's also some, with the GPS data, the speed data is not always perfect, so I'm not exactly sure how much weight I want to put into that. Yeah. Right here.
In terms of doing the survey again, or another city taking on this survey, what was the cost? I mean, is this going to be something that will be really hard for another city to replicate? And then if you guys do it again because you have the equipment already, just some of the details in terms of how you guys were able to make this happen.
Well, I should total up the cost because the original grant from Robert Wood Johnson was $150,000, but we spent far more than that. Like I've put far more time than we charged to Robert Wood Johnson. I've used other GRA time that wasn't billed, So, and then the O-Trek. The O-Trek, it wasn't billed to anyone else. It was PSU has contributed. The O-Trek, I'm forgetting what the O-Trek dollar amount was. It was under $100,000. The equipment, though, I have to say, and I think my GRAs would all agree that we will not use those IQs again. There's lots of problems. They are not built to be on a bike bumping up and down and doing all of this. There's newer GPS units that would work much better, and I have one that we're hopefully going to test. The only thing is that there's no data input. And we sort of like the idea of people telling us the trip purpose and the weather information. So we couldn't do that with the new GPS stuff. So I think, so much of our time and effort did go into all of the software and the processing of the data. And now maybe, I don't know, I keep looking at my two students who are working on this right now and the ones who've worked it in the past. If we're going to do it again, would it go faster? I would hope so, but there'd probably be more problems that it would erupt. Right here, and then back to Rob.
So you said already that you haven't spent a whole lot of time yet looking at the transit trips. I'm just curious whether, for one, maybe just if you have an idea of how frequently, in comparison to all the trips, transit was involved. And then also, in looking at those trips where they use transit, they link to transit, obviously you can tell, what like the weather was, what direction they were heading, if there was they're heading, in town, downhill, and then uphill.
Yeah, if there was a pattern to it, we could. I would say right now it's probably less than 10%, somewhere in the 4 to 8%, somewhere in that range. But again, I need to really look at that data a bit closer. But we could, you guys are going to keep me very busy. We could look at that. Rob?
At the City of Portland, we're developing this concept of travel sheds for bikes, so zones that are defined for bike travel. So I'm wondering how easy or difficult do you think it would be to analyze this data in a way where you would look at the facility choice by zone, by geographic zone for these travel sheds, and then correlate choices, because part of the premise of the travel sheds is that we have some zones that are built well for bicycles. They have good diversity in terms of facilities. They have the full range of facilities, more options for bikes, better connectivity. Wondering if that really gets more at what you're after if you look at this data in a disaggregated way rather than just looking at the results in aggregate.
We definitely could, yeah. And I think that's sort of the next step is, not the full aggregate, but looking in certain locations. Because we have pretty good coverage, particularly within the City of Portland, to be looking at different geographic areas. Tima.
Kind of a follow-up to that and the question about housing choice. Do you have a way to look at where the participants lived? Because it seems like if 30% of their trips were to home, if you have a large proportion of people living near bike boulevards, well, it's likely more of their trips are going to happen on bike boulevards.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so we know, so that's the next step that we're working on right now, is we know exactly where everyone lives. So we'll look at a certain radius around their home, what facilities are available, what is the land use, is it more mixed use or not, what's the density, all sorts of physical environment questions around their home, and see how that relates to their behavior. Yeah. I saw more hands right here. And then, I'm sorry, we'll get in the back next.
I can't recall if you said this, but I was wondering if you looked at how long the participants had been cycling, and I was kind of curious.
Like how many years they've been a cyclist?
Yeah, because I think there's an assumption that, at least I was making, that the folks who were more infrequent were newer cyclists.
Yeah.
But then I was thinking about in terms of facility, there's kind of an assumption that kind of like bike paths and off kind of where you don't have auto traffic are kind of like the gateway drug for cyclists. Yeah. And I'd be curious to, I think it'd be interesting to see how if you see people going to more highly trafficked routes as they get more experience, but then conversely, as people learn about bike boulevards and become maybe a little, and I'm just thinking myself anecdotally, people who actually go away from the higher traffic and begin to say, you know what, the value of the experience is more than 5 minutes.
And as they get older, I mean, I think of where I bike now versus 20 years ago when I was a grad student in LA, and where I biked there, and I was crazy, where I biked. Unfortunately, I think that's one of my regrets in terms of the questions that we had on the survey. For some reason, and I don't remember why because it's been a while, we did not ask people how long they've cycled or sort of more of their cycling history. And I do regret that because I wish I could look at that. So, yeah. In the back, yeah, the orange.
So I was just wondering if you had any idea why you had 7% for the lowest category. I think it was like 4 miles per hour or something like that. And that seemed like a huge spike in basically a normal distribution. And I was wondering, if you had any idea if there were accidents or maybe everybody's going up a hill at that point, or any idea why there'd be a
I'm going to have to look at that. Yeah,
because that's a really slow.
That's fairly slow. Well, that includes zero speed, so stop. So I'll take a look at those more closely. And again, there's also questions of the data itself, and are there errors in the data? So that's something that we'll look at. Yeah. Zach?
For the breakdown by trips on with bike facilities and without bike facilities, you count the minor streets without bike lanes as being in the category of streets without bike facilities.
Yeah.
And I imagine those are mostly the local streets providing access to the neighborhoods. And I'm wondering, since those, don't think those would show up in Portland's bike plan or in the transportation system plan as being slated for improvements, what the numbers of the percent of bike travel by mileage would look like. Would that taken out, or would that category included as part of the bike infrastructure?
Well, you mean the minor streets?
No bike lanes.
Without bike lanes? Those are all future potential bike boulevards, or some of them are. They're clearly a big part of where people are cycling. And when they're in a connected street grid, they get used a lot by cyclists. So I don't think I'd want to take them out. And when I started looking, here, I sort of put them down below in sort of this low motor vehicle traffic facility. So if we start thinking of not just bike facilities versus not bike facilities, think a little more broadly that these local neighborhood streets, technically they don't have a bike facility on them, but are they facilitating bicycling because they're low traffic, and particularly if they're connected?
Well, they're the streets that provide access to houses, so.
Yeah, I mean, that's where most of the trips are going to start on one of those, but on a car trip, it's more likely you're going to take that, to get to the nearest arterial so you can go faster. On a bike trip, it's more likely that you're going to stay on those local streets if they're connected, at least some people, and not go on the arterial, particularly if it doesn't have a bike lane.
I agree. That's why I would suggest it would be interesting to look at the data, including those minor streets as part of the existing bike infrastructure.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I misheard you. Okay. Yeah. Roger?
Yeah, I actually want to follow up with that. And well, I would just recommend, no correction, I just recommend against it because, the bike boulevards are those streets where there's been some level of capital investment to make them work, particularly at arterial crossings, and to really go in and comprehensively slow the speeds and reduce the volumes. And like Jennifer said, a lot of those minor streets without any kind of facility, we've identified over 100 miles of them that we could potentially develop as bike boulevards. So make the capital investments to make them work better. So I think the way you've got them classified is good.
Yeah, including the one that goes right by my house is maybe a few.
Especially that one.
No, there's no earmark for a bike boulevard on my street. No, I don't have that much influence. Okay. We are about 1:30, and I really appreciate all of you being here and all of the great questions. And feel free to email me if you have more specific ideas to keep us and our grad students busy for several years. And stay tuned. I look forward to sharing more.